In the summer of 1906, on a sandbar at the bottom of Brooklyn, 3.5 miles long and in most places less than half a mile wide, there were three enclosed amusement parks operating within a few hundred yards of each other, and together they burned more electric light than any comparable patch of ground on the planet. Luna Park carried something on the order of 250,000 bulbs. Dreamland, directly across Surf Avenue, carried 1,000,000. Ships coming up the Atlantic coast at night reported seeing the glow on the horizon before they could make out the shoreline underneath it. And the light was not decoration, the light was the product. Almost none of the people riding the trains out to that beach had electricity in the rooms they slept in. They had gas, or they had kerosene, or they had nothing. What they were paying 10 cents to walk into was not a roller coaster. It was the experience of standing inside a building made entirely of light, at night, in the open air, with 100,000 strangers doing the same thing. That fact, that the most successful entertainment district in American history was fundamentally in the business of selling working people the sensation of electricity, is the first thing you need to understand about Coney Island. Because every version of this place has been killed in exactly the same way. Something arrives and makes the sand valuable. The crowds follow the thing that arrived. And then somebody sits down with a pencil and works out that the land is now worth more with nothing standing on it at all. There is a steel tower still standing at the western end of the beach, 250 feet tall, painted red, lit at night with programmable light-emitting diodes that cycle through the colors of the American flag on the appropriate holidays. It is the single most photographed object in the borough of Brooklyn after the bridge. Tour guides call it the Eiffel Tower of Brooklyn. It appears on the tourism posters, on the subway station tilework, on the shoulder patch of the local police precinct. It is the emblem of the place. It has not carried a paying passenger since 1964, and it was never built for Coney Island in the first place. The island had been a sandbar with rabbits on it. The Dutch called it Konijn Eiland, which is roughly where the name comes from, and for 200 years it was worth almost nothing because you could not easily get to it. It was separated from the rest of Brooklyn by a creek and a salt marsh, and the trip from Manhattan involved a ferry, a carriage, and most of a day. In 1829, a group of investors built a toll road out across the marsh called the Shell Road, and in 1847 the first hotel opened. For the next 25 years, Coney Island was a modest seaside retreat for people who could afford to lose a day getting there. What changed it was not a hotel and not a boardwalk. It was rail. In the 1860s and 1870s, 4 separate railroad companies pushed lines across the marsh to the sand, each one terminating at its own beach and its own hotel. Andrew Culver ran his line to the western end. Austin Corbin, a banker who had made his money in Iowa, built the Manhattan Beach Hotel at the eastern end in 1877 and ran his own railroad to its front door. William Engeman built Brighton Beach in between. By 1880, you could leave Lower Manhattan and be standing in the surf in under an hour, for a fare that a clerk could afford. That is the entire mechanism, and it is worth being precise about it, because everything that follows comes out of it. New York City in that period had somewhere over 1,000,000 people living on the island of Manhattan alone, most of them stacked in tenement buildings with no ventilation and no refrigeration, in a climate that spends 8 weeks a year above 90 degrees. There was no air conditioning anywhere in the world. The only cold place within reach of a working family in the month of July was the Atlantic Ocean, and the railroads had just made the Atlantic Ocean accessible for a nickel and change. Coney Island did not become the largest amusement district in the world because someone was clever. It became the largest amusement district in the world because it was the nearest available source of cold air to the most densely populated square miles in the Western Hemisphere. The man who ran the place for the first 20 years of that boom was named John Y. McKane. He had come up as a carpenter, and by the 1880s he held, simultaneously and without much embarrassment, the offices of town supervisor, police chief, chief of the fire department, president of the town board, and superintendent of the Sunday school. He controlled who got a liquor license, who got a gambling concession, who got arrested, and who did not. Under McKane, the western end of Coney Island, the part known as Norton's Point and the Gut, ran wide open. There were brothels, three-card Monte operations, unlicensed bars, and a hotel shaped like an elephant. That last one is not a figure of speech. The Elephantine Colossus was built in 1885, stood 122 feet high, and was constructed in the shape of an elephant with legs you entered through, and rooms in the body and a cigar store in one of the front thighs. It was intended as a hotel and observation platform. Within a few years it had become a brothel, which is the sort of trajectory the neighborhood tended to produce, and it burned down in 1896. The phrase, "seeing the elephant," meaning to go somewhere disreputable and come back changed, was already in circulation in American slang, but Coney Island gave it a literal address. The eastern end operated differently. Corbin's Manhattan Beach Hotel was a genuinely grand operation with a private railroad, John Philip Sousa conducting in the evenings, and a stated policy of excluding Jewish guests that Corbin announced publicly and defended in the newspapers. 2 miles of sand separated the elephant from the string orchestra, and both ends were making money. And in between them, for about 30 years, sat the largest concentration of thoroughbred racing in the United States. This is the part of Coney Island's history that has been almost completely forgotten, and it was for a period the most valuable thing on the peninsula. 3 major racetracks operated within a few miles of each other on the western end of Long Island. Brighton Beach, which opened in 1879, Sheepshead Bay in 1880, and Gravesend in 1886. They ran the biggest stakes races in American racing. The futurity at Sheepshead Bay carried purses that made it the richest race in the country. Special trains ran from Manhattan for race days, and the crowds that came out for them were not the crowds that came out for the elephant. The tracks existed on gambling, openly, with bookmakers standing in the betting ring taking wagers in cash. That arrangement was tolerated by New York for decades because a very large number of people with influence enjoyed it, and it ended in 1908 when the state passed a set of laws that made bookmaking a criminal offense and made the directors of a racing association personally liable for what happened on their grounds. The tracks tried to operate without bookmakers, discovered that a racetrack without betting is a field with horses running around it, and closed. All 3 were gone within a few years. Sheepshead Bay, which had been the finest racing plant in America, was converted into a wooden board speedway for automobiles in 1915, ran for 4 seasons, and was then subdivided into housing. Gravesend and Brighton Beach went the same way. Something on the order of 1,000 acres of the most heavily capitalized recreational land in the New York region was liquidated in under a decade because the legislature changed one law, and the neighborhood that grew on top of it was, and is, ordinary Brooklyn housing. That is the first full-scale rehearsal of the pattern, and it happened before the amusement parks even reached their peak. The land was worth more subdivided than it was worth as a racetrack the moment the racetrack's revenue model was made illegal. Nobody had to be corrupt. The arithmetic simply changed on a specific date. The ocean, however, was eating the beach. By the mid-1880s, the surf had come far enough inland that the Brighton Beach Hotel, a wooden structure roughly 460 feet long, was in immediate danger of being undermined. So in the spring of 1888, the owners jacked the entire building up, ran 6 parallel sets of railroad track underneath it, loaded it onto 112 flat cars, and pulled it 600 feet inland using 6 locomotives working together. It took 9 days. Guests were served meals in the dining room while the building was in motion. Nobody today remembers that this happened, and it is a reasonable summary of what Coney Island was in that decade. A place where moving a hotel with a fleet of locomotives was considered a sensible business decision, and where nobody thought to stop and ask why the ocean was coming in. Then, in 1894, the state of New York finally prosecuted John McKane for election fraud, having caught him supervising an election in which the number of votes cast exceeded the number of adults living in the town. He went to Sing Sing for 4 years. His removal did not clean the place up so much as it opened the concessions to people with more capital and better ideas. And what those people built over the following decade was the version of Coney Island that everyone still has a mental image of, whether or not they have ever been there. The idea of enclosing it belonged to a man named Paul Boyton, who is not remembered at all and should be. Boyton had made himself famous in the 1870s by floating across the English Channel and down a series of European rivers in an inflatable rubber suit of his own promotion, and he had toured the world doing aquatic stunts. In 1895, he took a plot on Coney Island, put a fence around it, installed a water ride and a collection of trained sea lions, and charged a single admission at the gate to get in. That fence is the invention. Before Boyton, an amusement district was a street with attractions along it, each one taking a nickel at its own door, with anybody free to walk through without paying anything. After Boyton, the operator controlled the perimeter, knew exactly how many people were inside, and could set a price for the whole experience rather than competing for each individual coin. Sea Lion Park lasted about 8 seasons and was not especially profitable, and in 1903 it was taken over by 2 showmen who understood what to do with the idea. George Tillieu got there before them. He was a local, the son of a hotel operator, and he understood something that the men running the beer gardens did not, which was that the crowd would pay to be part of the show rather than to watch one. In 1897 he opened Steeplechase Park, 15 acres enclosed behind a fence, 1 admission price at the gate, and inside it a set of contraptions whose purpose was to make the customers look ridiculous in front of each other. There was a mechanical horse race that flung riders around a course on rails. There was a revolving disc that spun people off onto the floor. At the exit of the main ride there was a stage, and on the stage a clown and a dwarf with an electrified prod, and the ride deposited its riders onto that stage in front of several hundred seated spectators who had paid to watch it happen. The women's skirts blew up over compressed air jets. The whole park was a machine for manufacturing embarrassment, and it sold out every weekend for 67 years. Frederick Thompson and Elmer Dundee came next. They had run a ride at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, and in 1903 they took over a failing park and rebuilt it as Luna Park, which they wrapped in something close to 250,000 incandescent bulbs. Thompson was an architect by training, and he designed the whole thing in a style that belonged to no country that has ever existed. Minarets and lattices and towers that got narrower as they went up, all of it in staff and plaster on wooden frames, all of it outlined in light. On opening night, 45,000 people came through the gate. Thompson's central attraction had come with him from Buffalo, and it explains what these places actually were. It was called A Trip to the Moon, and the customer boarded a winged vessel that rocked and swayed while painted panoramas of the receding Earth moved past the windows. Disembarked into a papier-mâché lunar cavern, was met by costumed performers representing the inhabitants of the moon, and was given a piece of green cheese. That is not a ride in the modern sense. It is a theatrical production with the audience walking through it, and the entire early amusement industry consisted of variations on it: a trip to the North Pole, a submarine voyage, a descent into hell, a flight over Manhattan. The construction of Luna Park also produced one of the uglier episodes in the neighborhood's history. An elephant called Topsy had been used as a work animal on the Coney Island building sites and had killed a handler. In January of 1903, the animal was put to death by electrocution in front of a crowd of spectators, and the Edison Company sent a camera crew to film it. The footage survives and is easy to find, and it is regularly presented as an artifact of a war between electrical systems, which it was not. It was a public execution, staged as a novelty by a business that had recently learned that a crowd will pay to watch almost anything. William Reynolds looked at Luna Park and decided to beat it with money. Reynolds was a state senator and a real estate developer, and Dreamland, which opened in 1904 on 15 acres across Surf Avenue, cost him about $3.5 million, which is somewhere north of $120 million in today's money. Where Luna Park was gaudy, Dreamland was white and classical. Where Luna Park had 250,000 bulbs, Dreamland had 1 million. It had a 375-foot tower copied from a cathedral in Seville, a scale model of Venice with real canals, a working village populated by 300 people with dwarfism, a building where premature infants were kept alive in incubators and displayed to the public for a fee, and an attraction called Fighting the Flames, in which a 6-story tenement was set on fire and put out by professional firefighters several times a day in front of an audience of 4,000. The tenement fire show is worth sitting with for a moment because it tells you exactly who the customer was. The people paying to watch a building burn and be rescued were people who lived in buildings that burned and were not rescued. They came out from the tenement blocks of the Lower East Side on a 5-cent train, paid 10 cents to watch a controlled version of the thing they were most afraid of, and went home. Coney Island was not selling escape from their lives. It was selling their lives back to them, with the terror removed and the lighting improved. In 1907, Steeplechase Park burned to the ground. Tillieu, who had been operating on the beach long enough to have no sentimentality left, put up a sign on the fence the next morning offering admission to the smoking ruins for 10 cents, and people paid it. He had the park rebuilt within a year, and this time he put the whole thing inside a 5-acre glass and steel pavilion, so that it could operate in the rain and in the cold, and he mounted an enormous grinning face over the entrance with too many teeth in it. That face became the symbol of the place for the next half-century. Then, just after midnight on the 27th of May, 1911, a bucket of hot pitch tipped over inside an attraction at Dreamland called Hell Gate. The park was closed. The season had not started. The men working that night were doing pre-season repairs by the light of temporary bulbs, and when the pitch went over, the light circuits failed, and they were working in the dark on a wooden structure coated in creosote. Within 2 hours, the largest amusement park in the world was gone. Dreamland's water pressure had been diverted. The fire companies could not get enough on it, and the tower that had been copied from Seville came down into the middle of the fire. The animals from Dreamland's circus got out. A lion called Black Prince came through the fire with his mane burning, climbed the raised timber framing of a ride, and was shot on the Bowery by police who emptied their revolvers into him and then finished the job with an axe. That detail is in every account of the fire, and it is usually told as a piece of grotesque local color. It is better understood as an accounting event. Reynolds was underinsured. He had sunk his own fortune into the place, the insurance covered a fraction of it, and he made a decision within days that would set the pattern for the next 100 years of this island's history. He did not rebuild. He cleared the site and leased it as a parking lot. That is the entire mechanism of Coney Island, delivered in 1911, and everything after it is a variation. A parking lot on 15 acres of beachfront produced a reliable return with no payroll, no insurance exposure, no seasonal risk, and no possibility of a lion getting loose. Dreamland had employed thousands of people and had cost $3.5 million to build. The parking lot cost nothing and never burned. Nobody had to be corrupt or short-sighted for this to happen. The arithmetic simply favored the empty lot, and once the arithmetic favors the empty lot, an amusement district is on a clock. But the crowds did not stop coming, because the crowds were never really coming for Dreamland. They were coming for the ocean, and in 1920, the city of New York made the ocean nearly free. That was the year the subway reached Coney Island. Not a private railroad with its own fare and its own hotel at the end of it, but the municipal system at a flat 5 cents from anywhere in the 5 boroughs, running all day and most of the night. The effect was immediate and enormous. On a hot Sunday in the 1920s, the crowd on that beach reached a figure that contemporary estimates put at around 1 million people. There are photographs from the period that are difficult to read as photographs at all, because there is no visible sand anywhere in the frame, only a texture of bodies going all the way to the water. The infrastructure went up fast around that crowd. The Wonder Wheel, 150 feet of steel with cars that slide on interior rails as it turns, opened in 1920 and has run every season since. The Regalman Boardwalk opened in 1923, 80 feet wide and 2.5 miles long, which required the city to condemn the private beachfront and take it into public ownership, ending the era in which a bathhouse operator could own the sand in front of his own building. The Cyclone opened in 1927 at Surf Avenue and West 10th, cost $175,000 to build, and immediately became the coaster against which other coasters were measured. And in 1916, a man named Nathan Handwerker, who had been slicing rolls for Charles Feltman at 10 cents a frankfurter, opened his own stand and sold the same item for 5. He had been advised to do it by 2 of Feltman's singing waiters, one of whom was Jimmy Durante. The 5-cent price is the entire story of what Coney Island had become. The place was now operating at the price point of a subway fare, for a customer who had a subway fare and not a great deal more, and the local newspapers began referring to the whole district as the Nickel Empire. It was not meant as a compliment. It meant that 1 million people could come to your beach in a single day, and the businesses along it could still barely make a living. There was one attempt to run against that current, and its fate is instructive. In 1927, the Half Moon Hotel opened at the western end of the boardwalk, 400 rooms of brick with a tower and a lobby, built on the theory that if 1 million people a day were coming to this beach, some fraction of them ought to be persuaded to stay overnight at a proper rate. It was a substantial building, and it never worked as intended. The Coney Island customer had come out on a 5-cent train and was going home on it that night. Within a few years, the hotel was in financial trouble, and it spent the rest of its existence as a convalescent home and then a hospital before being demolished in the 1990s. Its one moment of national attention says everything about the district in that period. On the 12th of November, 1941, a man named Abe Reynolds went out of a 6th-floor window of the Half Moon Hotel and landed on the roof of an extension below. Reynolds was a contract killer for the organization the newspapers called Murder Incorporated, who had turned state's evidence, and he was being held in that hotel under the guard of 6 police officers in protective custody as the most important witness in an investigation that reached into the leadership of organized crime in New York. He was scheduled to testify shortly. The official finding was that he had been attempting to escape by climbing down a rope of knotted bedsheets. Nobody believed it then, and nobody believes it now. The prosecution he was central to collapsed. That is the trap the subway built. Volume went up and margin went down, and a business with no margin cannot maintain a wooden building in a salt environment. By the late 1930s, significant parts of the amusement zone were visibly decaying, not because nobody was coming, but because everybody was coming and nobody was spending. And into that situation walked the single most consequential figure in the modern history of this beach, a man who never held elected office and who did not like amusement parks. Robert Moses became Parks Commissioner of New York City in 1934 and held power in one form or another for the next 34 years. His view of Coney Island was consistent, and he never disguised it. He believed a beach should be a public beach, clean sand, orderly bathhouses, parking, grass, and no honky-tonk. The amusement zone in his assessment was a squalid commercial accretion sitting on top of a natural asset that belonged to the people of the city, and his objective across 3 decades was to reduce it. He had the tools. He widened the boardwalk and moved it inland. He extended the beach with dredged sand. He built the New York Aquarium on the site where Dreamland had stood, opening in 1957, which permanently converted the most famous 15 acres in the history of American amusement into an institutional facility with a fence around it. And in 1949, the amusement area was rezoned for residential use. That rezoning is the quiet event that decided everything. Once the land is zoned residential, an existing amusement business can continue, but it cannot expand. It cannot easily rebuild after a fire, and its owner is now sitting on a parcel that is worth substantially more sold than operated. Every incentive in the system now points the same direction it pointed for William Reynolds in 1911, except now it points that way permanently and by law. What went on to the rezoned land was public housing, and a great deal of it. Moses had at his disposal the federal slum clearance program created under the Housing Act of 1949, which allowed a city to condemn an area declared blighted, clear it, and turn the assembled land over for redevelopment. Coney Island was declared blighted. Blocks of bungalows and small frame houses at the western and inland edges came down, and in their place went towers, public housing, and later middle-income developments built under state programs, in the standard form of the period, which is to say, tall buildings set back from the street on open lawns, with no shops at the base and no street life of any kind between them. Something in the range of 10,000 people were eventually housed in those towers. It is important to be accurate about this, because the towers are frequently blamed for Coney Island's decline, and that is not what happened. The people who moved into them needed housing and got it. What actually mattered was the sequencing. The city cleared land and built dense residential towers in a district whose commercial economy it was simultaneously zoning out of existence, so that a large population arrived in a neighborhood at precisely the moment its employment base was being legislated away. The amusement industry that might have hired those residents was no longer permitted to grow, and there was nothing else there. By the middle of the 1960s, Coney Island had a resident population larger than at any point in its history, and an economy smaller than at any point since the railroads arrived. Luna Park had already burned in August of 1944, and it was not rebuilt. The site went to housing. Steeplechase held on the longest, because Tilliou's family held it, and because the glass pavilion was genuinely durable. But the crowds were thinning. The automobile had opened up Jones Beach and the Jersey Shore to anybody with a car, and the family closed it at the end of the 1964 season. In 1965, the site was bought by a Brooklyn housing developer named Fred Trump, who intended to build apartment towers on it, and discovered that the city would not grant him the zoning change he needed. He demolished the Pavilion of Fun anyway. Before the wrecking began, he held an event on the site, handed out bricks to the guests, and invited them to throw them through the stained glass panels of the grinning face. There are photographs of it. The bulldozing of that pavilion did not clear the way for anything, because the towers were never approved, and the site sat vacant for 35 years afterward. It was demolition as an argument, an attempt to end the case for preservation by removing the thing worth preserving. A group of Brooklyn residents had been organizing to have the pavilion designated a landmark. The building came down before the designation could be heard, which is the entire point of taking a building down quickly. What followed was the longest and least documented period in this island's history, roughly 1966 to 2000, and it is the part that people who were not there tend to skip. The amusement zone shrank to a few blocks. The vacant lots multiplied. Arson became routine enough that the fire department tracked it as a category. The city's fiscal crisis in the mid-1970s cut services across the outer boroughs, and Coney Island, which was now mostly public housing and empty land with a small strip of rides on the ocean side, got very little of what remained. What survived did so almost by accident. Dewey Albert, a builder, had opened Astroland in 1962 on the site of Feltman's old restaurant, and his family kept it running through the worst of it. The Cyclone was scheduled for demolition in 1972 and was saved by a public campaign, after which the city took ownership of it and leased it back to the Alberts to operate, which is how the oldest continuously operating wooden coaster in the country came to be a municipal asset run by a private tenant. The Wonder Wheel was bought in 1983 by Dinos Forderis, who had promised his wife he would buy it for her decades earlier when he was running a hot dog cart, and it has stayed in his family since. There is a version of this period that gets told as pure decay, and it is not accurate. What actually happened in those decades is that Coney Island stopped being a destination for the whole city and became a neighborhood beach for the people who lived around it, which meant Black and Puerto Rican and later Russian and Central Asian families from the towers inland and from Brighton Beach next door. The crowds did not disappear. They changed composition, and the city's interest in the place fell off at approximately the same rate. Those two facts are related, and the relationship is not subtle. The people who kept the rides running through it were operating with no capital, no bank willing to lend against a business on residentially zoned land, and an insurance market that had decided amusement operations in that neighborhood were uninsurable at any sensible premium. That any of it survived to 2001 is genuinely surprising. And there was the Thunderbolt, a wooden coaster built in 1925, which had a house underneath it. The house had been there first, a hotel, and the coaster was built over and around it. And after the ride closed in 1982, the owner's family went on living in the structure, with the coaster decaying over their heads. May Timpano lived under the Thunderbolt for years after the last car ran. In November of 2000, the city demolished the coaster without a formal hearing, on the mayor's direct order, on the grounds that it was unsafe. The demolition began before the paperwork was complete, and the city was later sued over it. That demolition happened for a reason, and the reason was standing next door. A minor league ballpark was being built on the Steeplechase site, the first new construction of any scale on that land since Fred Trump had cleared it in 1966, and the Thunderbolt was in the sightline. Keyspan Park opened in 2001. It cost the city roughly $39 million, and it seats about 7,000 people for about 70 nights a year. Which brings the story to the arrangement that exists now, and to the thing the title of this asks about. In 2009, the city rezoned Coney Island again. The plan designated a permanent amusement district of roughly 9 acres, mapped as parkland so that it could not be developed. Around it, the rezoning permitted hotels, retail, and thousands of units of housing on land that had previously been zoned for amusement use. The stated intention was to stabilize the rides by giving them permanent protection while allowing the rest of the neighborhood to be rebuilt. The practical effect was to fix the amusement district at a fraction of its historical footprint and to make every parcel outside that line substantially more valuable as something else. The parcels had already been bought. Beginning around 2005, a developer named Joe Sitt, operating through Thor Equities, assembled roughly 10 acres across the amusement area, paying prices that made sense only if the land was going to be rezoned. He then declined to renew leases. Businesses that had operated on that boardwalk for decades were cleared, and the lots stood empty, in some cases for a decade, with chain link around them and weeds coming through the asphalt, in the middle of the district. Astroland's lease was not renewed, and it closed at the end of the 2008 season after 46 years. The strategy behind that is not complicated, and it is entirely legal. A developer who believes a district will be rezoned buys as much of it as possible beforehand, at prices set by its current use. The rezoning then converts the same dirt into something worth several times more. In the interval, the rational move is to hold the parcels vacant because a boarded lot costs almost nothing to carry, while a functioning business creates tenants, obligations, community attachment, and potentially a political constituency that will object when the time comes to build. Emptiness is not a failure of the plan. Emptiness is the plan, executed patiently. What that looked like on the ground was a stretch of the most famous boardwalk in the United States with plywood over the windows, for years, in full view of several million visitors a season, while the owner waited. Businesses that had been in those buildings for 2 and 3 generations were simply not offered new leases. Some of them had been paying rent on that boardwalk since the 1940s. The city eventually bought some of those parcels back at considerable expense and brought in an Italian ride manufacturer, Zamperla, to operate a new park on the old Astroland site. It opened in 2010 under the name Luna Park, which is the name of the park that burned in 1944, on the ground where a different park stood until 2008. This is now the standard procedure. The names are recycled because the names are the only asset that survives. Then, in October of 2012, Hurricane Sandy pushed the ocean over the boardwalk and into the neighborhood. The surge flooded the amusement district, the aquarium, the ballpark, and the public housing towers on the inland side, where residents in high-rise buildings were without power, heat, and working elevators for weeks. The rides were repaired in time for the following season because rides are insured and can be repaired in 6 months. The housing took years. The cyclone ran on schedule in the spring of 2013, while people 3 blocks inland were still living with temporary boilers parked on the sidewalk outside their buildings. That gap between how fast the attraction came back and how slowly the neighborhood did is the clearest possible statement of which of the two the city is actually organized around. And then, in 2020, something happened that clarified the entire question. For the first full summer since the Second World War, the amusement parks did not open. Luna Park stayed closed. Dino's stayed closed. The Cyclone did not run. The arcades, the games, the ride operators, the ticket booths, the seasonal jobs that the entire industry depends on, none of it happened. The beach was packed. People came out on the subway in June and July and August exactly as they had in 1925, spread their towels on the sand and went in the water. The boardwalk was full. Nathan's did takeout. What the closure demonstrated, in a way that no study could have, is that the crowd is not there for the amusement industry. The crowd is there for the ocean and the train, which is what it has been there for since 1880. The amusement district is a business that sits next to the real attraction and sells to the people the real attraction brings, and it has always been the more fragile of the two. That is the answer to why the rides keep dying while the beach never does. The ocean requires no payroll. It cannot burn. It carries no insurance premium, needs no seasonal staff, and cannot have its lease declined. And it draws several million people a year to a piece of ground that a developer can therefore justify buying at a price no amusement operator could ever earn back at the rate of $5 a ride. The current numbers make the point in a different direction. The amusement district now employs a few thousand seasonal workers for about 5 months a year. The census tracts immediately inland of the boardwalk are among the poorest in Brooklyn, with poverty rates that run well above the borough average and a housing stock dominated by public towers built in the 1960s and 1970s on land the amusement zone used to occupy. Median household income in those tracts is a fraction of what it is in the brownstone neighborhoods 4 subway stops north. The seasonal jobs pay seasonal wages. The residents who live closest to one of the most visited beaches in the United States receive very little of what it generates. The one thing that has been protected is the surface people walk on. In 2018, the Regalman Boardwalk itself was designated a scenic landmark by the city, which came after a long fight over the fact that the Parks Department had been replacing sections of wood with concrete and recycled plastic. That fight is a good miniature of the whole place. An argument conducted with real passion over the material of the walkway, taking place alongside a set of decisions about 10 acres of adjacent land that will determine what the walkway leads to, and receiving a fraction of the attention. And the parcels are still in play. There is now a proposal to build a casino in the amusement district, backed by a consortium that includes the same real estate interests that spent the last 20 years assembling the land, on the argument that a casino would provide year-round employment in a neighborhood that has had 5-month employment for a century. That argument is not frivolous. A community where the work stops in September and does not resume until May has a specific kind of poverty, and permanent indoor jobs at a decent wage would address it in a way that nothing else on offer would. The opposition argues that a casino would take the last of the amusement acreage and finish what the 1949 rezoning started, and that the neighborhood has heard promises about what a large new building would do for local employment several times before, most recently about a baseball stadium that opens 70 nights a year. Both sides are describing the same underlying fact, which is that this land is worth more than the entertainment standing on it, and has been since 1911, and that every 20 or 30 years somebody arrives with a proposal to realize that value, and a case for why this time the neighborhood will share in it. Coney Island has been a rabbit sandbar, a carriage road, a set of railroad hotels, a wide-open vice district run by a Sunday school superintendent, an electric city of 3 enclosed kingdoms, a nickel empire of 1 million people a day, a Moses Beach, a burned-over district of vacant lots, a ballpark, and now a set of assembled parcels awaiting a decision. Each of those replaced the one before it, and each replacement was presented at the time as the thing that would finally make the place work. The fire that took Dreamland was supposed to be an accident. The subway that brought 1 million people a day was supposed to make everyone on that beach rich. The rezoning that killed the amusement industry was supposed to give the ocean back to the public. The developer who cleared the boardwalk businesses was supposed to be building something. The ballpark on the Steeplechase site was supposed to bring the crowds back, and the crowds had never left, because the crowds were never coming for any of it. The racetracks that were the most valuable land on the peninsula became housing the year after bookmaking was outlawed, and the parcels that were cleared to build a park that burned became a parking lot that became an aquarium. And the pavilion that was demolished to force a rezoning that never came sat empty for 35 years until it became a stadium that opened 70 nights a year, and the whole of it now sits inside a zoning map drawn in 2009 that permanently fixed the rides at 9 acres and permanently freed everything else. Every one of those conversions was carried out by someone acting sensibly on the numbers in front of them. That is the part worth holding on to. There is no villain in this story who wanted Coney Island destroyed, and the people usually cast as villains, Reynolds, Moses, Trump, Sit, were each doing the obvious thing given what the land was worth and what the law permitted. The place has been taken apart 4 times by ordinary commercial reasoning applied to the most valuable oceanfront within subway distance of 8 million people. And the only force that has ever reliably held any of it in place is that a beach cannot be moved and cannot be sold to somebody who wants to put it somewhere else. The parachute jump is still standing at the western end, 250 feet of red steel, lit every night, on the posters and the tile work and the police patch. The city has spent millions painting it and millions more lighting it. It is the official emblem of Coney Island, and it is a New York City landmark. It was designed as a device for teaching men to fall out of aircraft. It was erected in Queens for a World's Fair that ran 2 summers and closed, and it was brought here in 1941 because it was available second-hand and the freight was cheap.